I never forget one young lad who came from Derry, and he'd been in prison several times. A very hurt young lad. Do you know, he said to me, he said, you know, this is the first place that anybody ever bothered about me. That's what Corrymeela is about. I remember the day it was open, making a simple speech, and I said, Corrymeela is to be the open village, open to all people, men and women of goodwill who are willing to meet together, to talk together, to pray together, and to work for the good of the whole. I always feel there's a very healing atmosphere about this place, and you can see that in groups that come from areas of violence. You can almost watch them beginning to relax when they get into that atmosphere. You're remote, and also you're in a very beautiful part of our country.
Corrymeela is more than a place, a retreat from the Troubles. It's a Christian community of 160 members living throughout Northern Ireland and further afield, who share a common commitment to work for reconciliation and peace.
I'm coming to you today as a Palestinian, but also as a Christian, but not least as an Arab, and also as an Israeli citizen or a citizen of Israel. Can you believe that all can be one identity?
Speaking at Corrymeela, Father Elias Shakur from Galilee, whose experience of war motivates his work to overcome fear and division in the Middle East. Corrymeela is part of the community of the Cross of Nails, based in Coventry. It links centres of reconciliation throughout the world. Its inspiration arose from the suffering of the last war, when an air raid caused massive loss of life and left the city and its cathedral in ruins. 14th century nails from the rubble have become a symbol of hope. Ray Davey's life was turned around when, as a prisoner of war, he witnessed the bombing of Dresden. He returned to Belfast to work for peace, which for him was not just the avoidance of war, but helping Northern Ireland become a community built on mutual respect and the participation of all. Ray was brought up in Dunmurry, at that time a quiet village 5 miles from Belfast City, with its own distinct, tightly knit community. He was a son of the manse, Ray's father having worked his way up from a humble farming background to university and the Presbyterian ministry. As a boy, Ray heard visitors to the manse discussing the theology of a distant relative, Professor Ernest Davey, who was charged with heresy, but found not guilty. At home, he received a grounding in the Presbyterian faith and the necessity to respect those who were different. But at school, sport was his abiding passion.
It gave you a real chance to get to know people when you travelled to different schools all over the north of Ireland, and you had time to talk to people, and playing together creates a great sense of team spirit and belonging, indeed of community. And I'm eternally grateful to sport along that line because it taught me a great number of things.
He was chosen to play full-back for Ulster against the All Blacks in November 1935. Ulster held them to a 3-3 draw. It's a match still talked about. At Queen's University Belfast, sport was still a priority. He became president of the Queen's Athletics Association, but uncertainty was in the air.
I'm sure when one looks back at that time, the dominating thing tended to be what was going to happen. remember that was the time of Mussolini and Hitler on the ascendant in the Spanish Civil War, Mussolini in Abyssinia, and the sort of threat of what Hitler was going to do. And I was fascinated, like all my generation, what was going to happen. And as time went on, we realized that we really wouldn't be able to stay out of this.
Ray decided to follow in his father's footsteps and train for the Presbyterian ministry.
My first appointment was to the beautiful old First Bangor Presbyterian Church. But mind you, I can remember very vividly my first official duty there. I just arrived on the Friday and I had to take the service on the Sunday. And it was the 3rd of September 1939. The church was packed to the doors. Not, I should say, because I was taking it, but because just half an hour before the service started at 11 o'clock, the Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had broadcast to the nation telling them that we were at war with Germany.
Stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war.
You can realize what the atmosphere was, the emotions, the feelings, the anxiety, the fears of all the people. The old people had vivid memories of the casualty lists and the sufferings that they had gone through in the First World War. The young people, on the other hand, were very nonplussed. They'd never had an experience like this before. So for everyone there, it was a very emotive occasion.
Ray Davey had a dilemma. What was he going to do in the war? His solution was to volunteer as a field worker with the YMCA. He set sail down the Clyde on the Oronsay as part of a 10-ship convoy. They had hardly met open water when an enemy plane made contact.
We were very fortunate, as it turned out, that the bomb couldn't have missed the boat more narrowly, but it exploded in the waterline and it blew a hole on the side of the liner, the Oronsay. And it machine gunned the decks, and we understood that some 10 to 12 soldiers lost their lives, which was very sad.
5 weeks later, Ray re-embarked from Liverpool, this time on the Andes built in Belfast, and arrived safely in North Africa to begin his work.
We were commissioned by the YMCA to meet the spiritual, the educational and the social needs of the troops as far as possible. I was assigned to go up from Alexandria to the Western Desert.
As the army advanced, the YMCA followed the front line of battle, providing rest stations for the troops.
Tobruk was built by the Italians as a sort of naval base. What we did was we went in shortly after it had fallen. The British Army had taken it, and we purloined a block of flats. This was the front line for quite a long time, and it meant that a great number of units were stationed in the Tobruk perimeter and right across the desert. Literally, Tobruk was the only place they had to go. We were fortunate getting this block of flats, and pretty well everything under the sun that could be done, we tried to do it. We had a canteen, and there's always a queue in the canteen. We had a tea service. We had a radio room where they could listen to the news, a music room where they could play gramophone records. We had lectures. We had availability of a library and books, and we had a chapel. And You know, it was the most ecumenical institution I have ever been associated with, because the Jews used it, the Catholics used it, the Plymouth Brethren had prayer meetings there, the Church of England had some of their services there, and we ran our own YMCA service on Sunday night. And I felt that was so right and so natural, that this was a place that was open to everybody. And I've never forgotten that.
But Tobruk proved to be too near the front. The YMCA were advised to evacuate their centre.
We were completely unprepared for it. I decided to go down from Tobruk to the army headquarters to find out really what was happening. Well, I only got to the door, and there were 2 or 3 German paratroopers, and one with his Tommy gun, or whatever type of gun it was, pointing at me. And I'm afraid I just put up my hands, the only thing I could do, and all my companions came out after me, and one of the Germans sized it up, "For you, Tommy, the war is over." And he was quite right.
One of the colleagues taken captive with Ray now lives in retirement in Northampton. Fred Hill was a Salvation Army officer operating a mobile canteen with the Tobruk YMCA as one of his bases. But that was a long time ago.
Ah, Fred.
Ray, great.
Marvellous to see you.
After all these years. Oh, do come in.
I can hardly believe it.
Do come in.
You've worn very well.
Oh, not too bad. Right.
very well.
Inside, yes.
Oh, they're very nice.
The last time Ray and Fred were together was in a prisoner of war camp where they tried to carry on their work of caring for the soldiers.
Oh, it's lovely to see you again.
Great to see you
And just
again.
that's a
After all,
sort of
how
shock
many years is
on
it?
Isn't it? I
About-
reckon it's 43.
43, 44, yes.
Yeah,
I think I
nearly
came once to
on-
Belfast.
Nearly 44.
I can see Ray now coming in night time into our barracks, having walked around the camp with somebody, trying to cheer them up and try to help them. Because you see, in the camp, there were 3-tier bunks, close together. Some people could stay on the bottom bunk all day and all night and simply disintegrate, drift out, finally die, not even be interested in their skilly. And in the camp, therefore, among the Christians, there was what was called an anti-bed squatting league. So the Christians were committed to finding people who were disintegrating, letting themselves go, bringing them out, taking them out, walking them around and talking to them. So he was very committed then to applying Christianity to everyday life. So I always had a feeling that the seeds of Corrymeela were sown there.
As a prisoner of war, Ray's Christian commitment meant taking the very difficult decision not to apply for repatriation. As he wasn't a member of the armed forces, it was possible that Ray could be soon enjoying the comforts of home. But supporting his fellow prisoners was more important. In 1945, he was imprisoned in a Colditz-type castle near Dresden. He was allowed to act as an area chaplain.
I travelled round all these different work camps in Dresden with my guard, and I was given permission to do a trip for 10 days, and it finished on the 13th. And I said to my guard, I said, look, I'm far more use here, because a lot of prisoners are coming in with frostbite and all sorts of things, than going back to the 15 miles to our castle, our headquarters. And he said, orders are orders, we must go back. So we left Dresden on the train round about 2 o'clock, and it was that night that the raid came and I was back in the castle. Dresden was bloated with refugees. Dresden was about the size of Belfast, 500,000, plus probably 300,000 more people. And I don't mind saying that I was shaking in my bed with the great armada of planes that seemed to be came right across the roof with terrific noise, and the German guards began to shout to make sure everybody got down, and the sky filled up. It was like some horrible apocalyptic dream. Those heavy bombs broke the crust, as it were, and then the incendiary bombs started thousands and thousands of fires, and then they all combined in a great massive conflagration. And you know, the temperature rose from normal to 800 to 1,000 degrees centigrade. And that meant that there was a terrific suction. The cold air was drawn in with a terrific force, and it meant that anyone round the city was sucked into that. And again, it was apocalyptic. You couldn't write a worse horror story of a mother going along with her child, vainly trying to get away from the bombing and being sucked back in again. And that was the story of a great number of people. To realize that in that city, about the size of Belfast, well, no one knows the exact number. Some people would say it was 300,000, some would say it's much less. But it must have been 70 or 80,000 people had lost their lives. To see the human side of that, to see streets and streets and streets flattened, that is something that will always be in my psyche, that seeing that, and the devastation of modern war and what it cost in human terms.
It had taken 4 months for the news of Ray's capture to reach home. He was allowed to write 1 card a week and an occasional letter. Kathleen Burrows received more than her share. The war had parted them. She was now the leader of a community centre in Edinburgh. The letters were a lifeline.
The trouble was they often got rather mixed up. And I remember, I should say, before we went away, we weren't engaged. And our sort of developed through the years. And I remember writing, I suppose it was a proposal to Kathleen. And apparently she got it the wrong way round. And the first letter I had was from my mother-in-law congratulating me on being engaged to her daughter.
At the end of the war, Ray's camp had to make a long trek across Germany to find the Allied troops.
There were 6 days when there was totally no news of any kind of what had happened to him. And naturally, my imagination feared the worst, and yet the uncertainty was almost more unbearable than knowing the worst. You can imagine what it was like when VE Day actually did occur, how absolutely doleful I felt. People were dancing up and down, but it was a very mock rejoicing on my part.
Well, when I arrived in Brussels, we were kept there for a couple of days. I remember very well because they gave us money and I had to spend money for 5 years and didn't know how to spend this money, and gave us new uniforms, and then they flew us into England. And then Kathleen was up in Edinburgh and working at a youth centre there. I remember the first phone call. The authorities said we could speak as long as we liked, but when it came to the point with very little to say.
And I lifted the receiver, and it was Ray. And we said hello to each other. And then followed 20 minutes when neither of us could utter. We just had no words would come. And Ray tells me at the end of 20 minutes that I said, "The blossoms here are lovely."
Your whole emotions, your mind and so on, it quite a time to catch up with where you were physically. But it was certainly a marvellous homecoming. And to remember that Kathleen and I hadn't seen each other for 5 years.
8 months later, Ray and Kathleen were married in Belfast. Just then, the Presbyterian Church was looking for someone to be their first full-time chaplain at Queen's University. The opportunity suited both Ray and Kathleen. Kathleen had studied at Queen's, worked as a teacher and youth leader. So with Ray, she had much to offer the new chaplaincy and started work there in 1946. Queen's was in a period of rapid growth. The 47 Education Bill meant that working-class accents mixed with the more refined. Ray was determined that the chaplaincy wouldn't be built around one person.
In my experience, he was one of the first people I met who simply said, if you've got a good idea, get on with it. So there weren't conditions placed on what you did. He wanted to encourage people to hope and to envisage new things being possible.
A post-war Thanksgiving fund enabled the chaplaincy to buy 7 College Park East, where the thought of building a Christian community could become a reality. Ray had met George MacLeod, the founder of the Iona community, soon after his return. Tradesmen and theological students had rebuilt Iona Abbey, and the symbol of the sacred and secular working together influenced Ray and the Belfast students who visited Iona.
When we thought about that and we thought about what they were doing, we began to see what its impact was or its meaning for us here in Ireland, and what we were trying to do to be some kind of an impulse or a symbol of how to put together Northern Ireland society in some new way. And out of that Iona experience of connecting faith and life, we got tremendous inspiration.
During the 50s and early 60s, there was a great vitality in life. Vacation jobs opened the opportunity for travel. Ray Davey brought groups of students to the countries he had been to as a prisoner of war.
One of the places that we went to in those sort of pioneering days was in North Italy, a place called Agape. And it was really a very fortunate choice. The leader was a marvelous man, still is, Tullio Vinai, who had started it off as a result of the very, very difficult experiences they had had in northern Italy when there was a sort of civil war there. And it was out of that pain and suffering, that this centre was built. There were young adults from all over the world there sharing their experience, and that was a great inspiration for us. And then after that, the students would say, maybe when we were coming home, why can't we do something like this in Ireland?
I was able to bring back home the ideas that young people were looking forward. They were not looking in on themselves. They were really looking outwards and trying to build a new world, really. And we had such pleasure in telling the other students when we returned about our visit, and telling them that this was something that all of them should try to do.
Quite a number of young people were interested, and it was very much the same idea of having a community, a Christian community here in Northern Ireland that would seek to move out to link the gospel with the realities of the 20th century, with the realities in our broken community, and not merely sweep them under the carpet. And those were the seminal ideas that came together when we decided to move ahead and try and do something here in Northern Ireland.
There followed months of discussions in the chaplaincy's new centre. How would a Christian community involving Protestants and Roman Catholics take shape in Northern Ireland? The students' commitment to the idea came to the test when a building which had been used as a Christian holiday centre came on the market. Built in 1932, the wooden structure was pretty run down. It was situated 1 mile from Ballycastle on the North Antrim coast. Ray knew Ballycastle well. It was there he had first met Kathleen. His family were regular visitors to Ballycastle for holidays.
Good morning.
Good to see
How
you.
are you?
What about you?
Oh, not too bad at all. You up at Corrymeela again?
Yes.
But
You
try it.
put on great weather for us.
Oh, marvellous.
This was to be the way forward. The student group decided to make an offer.
It was in a lovely part of the coast. It already had accommodation for 60 or 70 people, and we had no money, so it was a great start to have. And it also had the advantage of being a marvelously quiet place, a healing place where people could relax. And all these things made it for us a very suitable place. And when you think that we were able to purchase the whole place for, well, about £8,000, it was a very good beginning.
That was a lot of money then, and all of us went out and tried to raise the money, and we got it just in time. And I was lucky enough to be one of the first 6 people who came to Corrymeela, and we found a very dilapidated green building. We moved in and found there were no beds, a few chairs, a 3-legged table and mice running around the kitchen, and an old wooden sink. The loos weren't working, there was no water. We had to go up to the local farm to carry water down and go behind the bushes in turns. And when the first lot of work campers arrived, we had great fun saying to them as they came through the door, you know, you'll have to make your own beds. And they would say, rather surprised, well, okay, it's fine, where are the sheets? And we would say, no, here's the hammer and the nails, and you'll find the wood down in the next room there. We were all involved in doing everything. We cooked the breakfast, and we set up the worship, and we arranged the programme, and everybody was involved in the whole life of the community at that time.
The dedication ceremony was something that I'll never forget. The thing that always lives in my mind is the marvellous procession we had of work campers coming up the hill that leads up here, and carrying their buckets and their spades and their paintbrushes and their hammers, and looking the part, and it seems to me that made it a very living, not a stuffy occasion.
The opening ceremony was performed by the founder of the Agape community in northern Italy, Tullio Vini.
We all know that there are people who would welcome division in Ulster.
Terence O'Neill, Northern Ireland's Prime Minister, took part in Corrymeela's first public event called Community 1966. O'Neill met with considerable opposition. There were fears that he was selling out to Dublin. There was opposition to Corrymeela holding a political conference marking the 50th anniversary of the Dublin Rising. This was opening the way to an untried path which the protesters had no wish to travel.
I always knew when I accepted the invitation to come and speak at Corrymeela that there would be trouble, and there was some. I remember well that long drive up to Corrymeela with Protestant extremists holding their banners up, and some of them bashing the car as they went by.
Terence O'Neill came and made one of his great speeches about our great plea for better community relationships, whether you come from Finnehy or the Falls.
Well, I don't know that there was anything different from what my whole premiership was concerned with, and that was to try and get improved relations between Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, and improved relations between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. Those were my 2 main objectives, and Corrymeela fitted into that very nicely.
It's very important to show people that the Christian message we are trying to put across here is to be expressed not just in narrow spiritual terms, but in social and political terms. And I think that conference in 1966 did that. We didn't have wealth or grants or anything else in those days. We had to make our own way, and that meant that we had to start having work camps. And work camps meant that quite a large core of young people and some people not so young came down here and worked, and they worked very hard putting the site in order. And to do that meant that they got a real interest in what Corrymeela was about, and they began to feel that this is our place. And that, in a very important sense, created a community.
We spent a lot of our time painting and doing labouring jobs
about the centre. They were tremendously exciting days because there were so many different students from all over the world participating in many of the early programs, and Ray was always there guiding and helping us. He played a particularly important part in framing the subjects that we would discuss in our various group discussions in the evening. He was always stimulating us to think widely about the world in which we lived in and to explore the differences which existed in the different cultures we were exposed to through our experience of Corrymeela.
The Troubles erupted 4 years after the Corrymeela community started its work for reconciliation. Now there was rioting in Belfast, bricks and petrol bombs. The army was on the streets. People were driven out of their homes as fear and distrust transformed familiar neighbours into objects of suspicion. With the introduction of internment without trial, streets where children played were now a battleground between rioters and the army. Families whose homes had been engulfed by the violence had to move out.
I thought you could go right around there, and you were the other side of that, right? Yeah. Many a time I remember that.
This is the point here where I came out with the children.
Yeah.
Right down.
Up there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's house there.
Yeah.
And right down here to this roundabout.
Yeah.
Then the soldier let us through and we were allowed to walk. This is where the soldiers all were. They just weren't letting anybody in or out. I think when the commanding officer saw me with the 7 children, you know, I was absolutely terrified. And he just waved the soldiers to the side and said, let them through, let them through. So I just I didn't look back. I just made straight for that road there.
Yeah, yeah. I remember that was a very, very bad time in Belfast, especially in West Belfast.
Yeah,
a great number of the people were going out. I remember a lot of them went down to the Republic.
That's right. There was a lot went south.
Yeah.
As a actual fact, I thought that's where I was going.
Yeah.
I thought that's where they were taking all refugees south of the border, you know.
Yeah.
But when the bus stopped, I didn't even know where I was at all. You know, I just remember the bus going in through these big gates and seeing like a big school thing. I didn't even know where I was.
Yeah.
I'll never forget that. Like, I was coming off the bus and I was still very shaken.
Yeah.
Because I didn't know my bounds. I didn't know where I was, you know. And you were standing just down the bottom of the steps and you just took my 2 hands just like that there, you know. And you said to me, you'll be all right now. And I really felt such a sense of relief, you know. And everybody was so friendly and so caring, you know. And the children just sort of disappeared out of my sight altogether, you know. And it was great to be able to sit and talk and be relaxed, you know, and not think that there was going to be any more trouble that night, or, you know. It was a really beautiful experience. And then Corrymeela, as you know, was an ongoing thing for me from then on.
Corrymeela's centre of Ballycastle was a world away from the Troubles. The 64-mile drive from the violence of Belfast took parents and children on one of the most scenic routes in Northern Ireland.
Very good to have you all here. I always enjoy talking about Corrymeela. In the early days, I think it restores my youth. Corrymeela wasn't a response to the violence. I think
Ray has retired from the leadership of the community, but he still has a central role.
The young people then were asking very sharp questions about living in a divided society.
In the past 25 years, there's been constant development of the Ballycastle site. New buildings have had to be erected. When Corrymeela opened, it took less than £3,000 a year to run its programme. The present cost is well over £1,000 a day.
Since 1965, the centre has now grown to quite a large complex now. We now have 3 main living areas and we've got 150 beds. And really each week, 6 to 10 groups would come and stay with us from a variety of different sort of backgrounds, schools, young people, conferences, families, various Christian education programs. And in the course of a year, probably 200, 220 groups would come through, something in the region of 8,000 people, plus thousands of day visitors coming through and spending parts of an afternoon or something there with us as well. We've got a staff up here at the centre of 30, of whom 10 would be volunteers from various parts of the world. And we also have a staff of 10 in our Belfast centre.
This too is a meeting place for youth and family work, a place where friendships begun at Ballycastle can be continued. It's also the administrative centre for the community and provides accommodation for other voluntary groups.
That's all right, well, you go root me, you go scorn me, you go scandalize my name, since my soul's got a seat within the kingdom. That's all right.
Corrymeela has influenced the formation of the Northern Ireland Hospice and such groups as Women's Aid and the Samaritans. There's been a deliberate policy not to build an empire around Corrymeela's concerns, but to encourage its members to cooperate with existing agencies.
Down in the valley to pray, my soul got so happy that it stayed all day. Since my soul's got a seat within the kingdom, that's all right, that's all right, well, that's all right, that's all right, that's all right, that's all right.
The theme workshops will be starting
Of the voluntary bodies working in Northern Ireland, I would say that Corrymeela was far and away the best known one in England. And this comes about for lots of reasons, partly because Coventry Cathedral was involved in raising the funds for one particular house here, partly because the Friends of Corrymeela in England have been extremely active and have raised a lot of money themselves, promoted visits, exchanges, conferences, and a host of other activities.
Reading is the focus for Corrymeela support in England. From an office at the back of this church hall, £2,500 each month are sent to the Belfast office. Corrymeela Link, as they call themselves, have 2 full-time workers, 1 part-time, and a host of volunteers. They keep the 18 Corrymeela support groups throughout Great Britain in touch with one another. Since 1975, they've contributed over £350,000, but fundraising is not their primary concern. They want to develop understanding and support of what Corrymeela stands for. Each year they circulate 30,000 churches with information about Corrymeela Sunday, when Christians throughout Great Britain, with the backing of church leaders, pray for peace in Northern Ireland and for the work of Corrymeela. The number of speaking engagements marks the extent of their commitment.
We want freedom, freedom and peace. You cannot destroy our dream. We want freedom, freedom and peace. You cannot destroy our dream.
A song from Black South Africa, sung by Swedish blondes at Corrymeela. Cantamas are regular visitors. Their church in Sweden welcomes groups of young people from Corrymeela.
You cannot destroy our dream. Love, love, you cannot destroy our dream.
Cantamas have come for Summerfest, when for 1 week every other year, the Ballycastle site is converted into a tented village, and hundreds crowd in to hear the speakers, join in the workshops, and have a good time meeting all kinds of people.
I
think in many ways, Summerfest grew out of experience which Ray Davey had of going to the Kirchentag in Germany and seeing this major festival, which they have every 2 years, much, much larger than Summerfest, but something which brought people from all the churches and all parts of society together to look at contemporary issues. And I think as Ray has so often done over the years, when he's experienced things in the broader world, he's raised the question, well, do we have something to learn from that? Could we perhaps use something of that experience in our own situation? Is there something that we ought to try in Ireland? This is a good opportunity for people from other countries to come and through Summerfest meet people from Northern Ireland, learn about many of the issues, as well as bring their own perspectives. So this time, I think there are some 60 people from England and Wales and perhaps 20 from Scotland. But then looking further afield, we've had small groups from Sweden, individuals from Finland and Norway and Denmark, from South Africa and New Zealand, quite a number of people from the United States, and very significantly a small group from the DDR, from East Germany.
Corrymeela continues to host political conferences. Some unionist and nationalist politicians are willing to use this neutral venue for unofficial talks about how they see the future. The significance is not in the agreement reached, but in the fact that both sides join in the same conference, when officially their parties refuse to come around the table.
I'd no idea there was so much in the Bible about poor. 300 references in the Old Testament alone. And it's the variety of words, there's 9 in the Old Testament. And the scale of it.
Corrymeela's programme tackles the many divisions in society, but in Northern Ireland they have had to struggle with religious prejudice. The community, born in a Presbyterian chaplaincy, has deliberately broadened its membership.
There's always been a Catholic involvement, and there's always been Catholic priests involved at different stages, at community events and working with people and leading events in Corrymeela. I would be the first Catholic priest to be on the staff, and I've been on the staff now for about nearly 6 years. And I find that gives me a great opportunity to meet and to work with both Protestant clergymen, lay Catholics and lay Protestant people. And I find that great, of great value to myself and my own thinking, my own life and work.
Historically, that has been the case.
Efforts have been made to involve Protestants of the evangelical tradition.
I'm here at Corrymeela, and I'm happy to be involved in Corrymeela because I believe that evangelicals need to face the issues that Corrymeela are facing. Evangelicals need Corrymeela. But I do also believe that Corrymeela needs evangelicals. From 10 years ago, issues of poverty and violence and oppression were not connected to my faith. My faith was about something about a personal, individual God and a personal salvation and a personal relationship with that God. And part of my pilgrimage has to come to see that if my faith has got nothing to say about the violence in this country, then it's got nothing to say.
Some evangelicals now quote Ray Davey, but others have doubts about Corrymeela is Christian enough. Is it any more than another social work agency? But Christian faith is central to its programme.
It's often my job when I go to Corrymeela to conduct worship. We have it twice a day. And as I look around, I can see all sorts of different people. Maybe people have lost someone in the violence, young people who are unemployed over the years, and many with different problems. And most of them knowing really very little about the church, very vague ideas. How do you speak about the gospel to people like that in terms that they can understand? And I've always felt the only thing you can do, you tell them about the man who came from God and the sort of life that he lived, the things he did, his care for the underprivileged and hurt people, the publicans and sinners, and the outcasts, the prostitutes, people for whom society has very little time for, the time he spent with them. And then he faced the crucial issues. The Jewish leaders wanted to keep their religion just for a sort of spiritual elite, and no place for the outsider like the Samaritan. And one of his greatest stories was about the Good Samaritan. He made the Samaritan the hero of his story. And they can understand that, and they can relate to that sort of message and all the different things it meant, the sort of person he was. But there is a tremendous credibility problem. They want that to be made visible around about them if they're to believe it and live it. And in a very real way, I think that that's what Corrymeela is trying to do. To show them in visible terms what the Christian gospel is about what the love of Christ is about, not in any sentimental terms, but in real terms of caring.
Sean Armstrong was a community worker who was assassinated in Belfast in 1973. This playground was built in his memory and as a visible reminder of what remains to be done.
When you think that 2,500 people have lost their lives in this tiny community, how can you talk about arriving or having solved a problem? I think that our job is to live with it, to be there, to keep on doing the things that we are trying to do, and always hoping that a wider group of people in our community will come with us.
I don't think it's about achievement, but Corrymeela, I think, pointed up a number of things. It opened with a political conference with Terence O'Neill on Catholics and Protestants finding new ways to organise living together in this community. And 25 years later, that is certainly the main issue on the political agenda.
If we all can get together, and we've got an awful lot to learn from each other, no matter what our point of view, we need each other. And I feel that that is a tremendously important area for us to work together in for the future.
There's a saying, Corrymeela begins when you leave. But what kind of future awaits these young people? Will peace come to Northern Ireland in the next 25 years? The fact that Corrymeela continues to work for peace must in large part be due to its founder, Ray Davey. For those who know him, his worth isn't represented by the honorary degrees, the Man of the Year Award, the MBE and OBE, but as a person whose path to peace means affirming the worth of. In 1946 he wrote, "Christian community, in spite of all its lamentable divisions and failures, is the only hope for the world." Ray Davey still follows that principle and commends it to others.